Whose car is this? There is no way this belongs to you. Start talking.
Officer, my license and registration are right here. The vehicle is mine.
That doesn't tell me anything. You've got two choices. Let me search it, or you're living in cuffs.
Okay. I do not consent to any search. What is the legal basis for this stop?
The legal basis? You, in that car, in this neighborhood. That is enough for me.
A man sits behind the wheel of a pearl-white Lamborghini Urus on a quiet stretch of road in an outer district of Harris County, Texas. His hands are visible on the wheel. His documents are already in the officer's hand. He has answered every question calmly. He has done everything right. And still, the officer standing at his window has already decided. Not because of what the man did. Not because of anything the law required. Not because of anything observable, measurable, or legally articulable. But because of what the officer assumed the moment he saw a black man behind the wheel of a $250,000 vehicle on a road where, in that officer's mind, a black man had no business driving a car like that. Here is what that officer did not know. The man he was profiling had spent over 2 decades in law enforcement, not as a bystander to the system, but as someone who had risen through it, challenged it, and bent it towards something closer to what it was supposed to be. The man he was threatening with handcuffs had been appointed, exactly 3 days earlier, as the chief of police of the Harris County Police Department, the agency that employed the officer now resting his hand near his weapon. And the black leather briefcase sitting in plain view on that passenger seat, the one the officer was about to open without consent, without probable cause, and against 4 explicit statements of refusal, already contained that officer's termination notice. Signed. Dated. With his full name, his badge number, and the specific violations that had just been committed, in real time, on a running body camera. He opened the briefcase himself. He read his own ending. Stay with me. Because what comes after that moment is not just one story about one officer on one road in Texas. It is the story of what happens when a broken system finally meets someone who came prepared to fix it. What city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. This story is traveling farther than we expected, and we want to know where it's reaching. If you believe that driving an expensive car while black is not probable cause and should never be treated as one, hit the like button and subscribe. Because what comes next is the kind of accountability that most people never get to see completed. To understand what happened on that roadside in Harris County, you have to understand who was sitting in the driver's seat. Not the title. Not the badge. The person. Daniel Coppersmith grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the eastern edge of Houston. His father worked maintenance at a regional hospital. His mother worked the early shift at a grocery distribution center. They owned their home. They drove a reliable used car. They were not wealthy, but they had built something. Coppersmith would later say that the first time he understood what racial profiling felt like, he was 16 years old, riding in the passenger seat of his uncle's car, a clean, well-maintained Buick, when the lights came on behind them 3 blocks from their own house. The officer's first question was not about the speed of the vehicle or a broken taillight. His first question was where they were going. His uncle answered. Calmly. The way men in that neighborhood had learned to answer. And Coppersmith watched his uncle's hands stay visible on the wheel for the entire duration of the stop, never moving, never gesturing, as if his own body had become a kind of apology for existing in a car that someone in a uniform had decided he should explain. That stop produced nothing. No ticket. No citation. Just a few minutes on the side of the road and the kind of lesson that does not require words to be taught. Coppersmith did not grow up angry at law enforcement. He grew up wanting to change it from inside it, a distinction that people who have never tried it sometimes underestimate. Working from inside a broken system is not the same as endorsing it. It requires a particular kind of discipline. You have to be better than what surrounds you consistently enough and visibly enough that your presence eventually changes the shape of what surrounds you. He entered law enforcement in his early 20s, starting as a patrol officer in a neighboring county. He was not a fast riser in the political sense. He did not flatter supervisors or look away from problems that were easier ignored. He documented things. He filed things. He raised questions in meeting rooms when raising questions was inconvenient. Early in his career, he flagged a pattern of stops in his own precinct, stops concentrated almost entirely in one demographic, clustered in particular neighborhoods, producing searches at rates that bore no relationship to the complaint or infraction data. He brought the numbers to his supervisor. His supervisor thanked him and moved on. He brought them to the next supervisor. He was told the data was being reviewed. The data was not reviewed. He kept his own records. He kept them for years. He built the kind of institutional memory that only someone with patience treats as a long-term investment rather than an immediate weapon. Over 2 decades he moved through the ranks, sergeant, lieutenant, then captain, overseeing an entire district. In each role, the same pattern. Document. Escalate. Be told it is being reviewed. Watch it not be reviewed. Document again. What changed, eventually, was not the system. What changed was the level of federal scrutiny aimed at departments across Texas. Civil rights investigations. Consent decrees. The particular political weight that arrives when a pattern of constitutional violations becomes a federal concern rather than an internal one. Departments that had ignored internal voices for years found themselves under external pressure they could not manage away. Harris County was among them. The department had been under scrutiny for years. A federally commissioned review had produced a report that named the outer patrol districts, named the disparity in stop rates, named the search without cause complaint patterns, and produced recommendations that the department had accepted in writing and largely ignored in practice. The county needed someone credible to lead a real reform effort. Not a cosmetic one. Not a press release followed by a policy memo followed by no discernible change. Someone with a record of actually doing the work, someone whose presence in that role could not easily be characterized as performance. Coppersmith agreed to take the role under one condition he stated plainly before accepting: he would not be managed. He would make the decisions that needed to be made, including the ones that would be politically uncomfortable, and the county leadership would support those decisions or find someone else. The county agreed. On day 1, he reviewed the department's full complaint file going back 5 years. On day 2, he reviewed the personnel files of the officers flagged most frequently. On day 3, he drove into the district with the highest complaint volume, in his own car, to see what the files described in practice. He did not have to wait long. The pearl-white Lamborghini Urus was not a prop. It was not a statement. It was a car that Coppersmith had purchased after 2 decades of public service on a salary that required deliberate saving to reach the price of a vehicle like that one. He drove it the way anyone drives something they worked a long time to own, with the quiet satisfaction of a thing that belongs to you because you made it belong to you. He had reviewed Officer Seth Collins's file the day before. 2 prior complaints. Both involving black men. Both involving luxury vehicles. A physician in a late-model BMW who had been stopped, questioned about ownership, and searched without cause. A small business owner in a Mercedes who had endured the same sequence. Both complaints reviewed. Both resulting in verbal warnings. Neither producing any disciplinary action. Neither changing Collins's patrol assignment or behavior. The file was clear. This was not an officer who had made a mistake once. This was an officer who had developed a pattern, watched that pattern go unaddressed, and continued. Coppersmith placed the briefcase on the passenger seat before he turned the ignition. The termination letter had been prepared the previous evening. It cited the 2 prior complaints. It cited the pattern finding. It cited the constitutional violations he fully expected Collins to commit, because the file told him exactly what Collins did when he saw a black man behind the wheel of an expensive car in this district. The briefcase was not locked. Not hidden. Placed in the most visible location available to anyone who chose to conduct a warrantless search, the passenger seat, in plain sight, waiting. He turned on the audio recorder. He drove into the outer district, legally, within the speed limit indicators used, full stops at every sign. 18 minutes into the drive, the blue and red lights appeared behind him. Officer Seth Collins was a 9-year veteran. His file showed commendations in his first 3 years. After that, 2 complaints, 2 verbal warnings, and nothing else. No escalation. No intervention. No pattern review. Just the quiet administrative signal that in this department, constitutional violations had a ceiling, and that ceiling was a conversation that went on record and produced no consequence. He leaned into the driver's window, and what his mind did with what he saw was visible in every word that followed. He demanded to know whose car it was. Coppersmith was composed. Hands on the wheel. He stated the vehicle was his and produced his license and registration without being asked twice. Collins looked at the documents and said they proved nothing. He gave the choice that was not a choice: consent to a search or leave in handcuffs. Coppersmith stated clearly that he did not consent. He asked for the legal basis of the stop. Collins did not provide one. The driver cited his Fourth Amendment rights. He stated he would not exit the vehicle without a lawful reason. He stated his non-consent a second time. Collins ordered him out. His tone left no room for the possibility that the man in the car had rights that exceeded the authority of the uniform standing outside it. Coppersmith exited, hands raised, every movement deliberate and careful in the way that black men in America learn to make their movements deliberate and careful when an officer's hand rests near his weapon on a public roadside. The pat-down produced nothing. Not one item of concern. Collins confirmed, for the running body camera and for the audio recorder inside the vehicle, exactly what had always been there: a man who had done nothing wrong. He announced he was searching the vehicle anyway. He said an expensive car in that neighborhood was cause enough. Coppersmith stated his non-consent a third time. Then a fourth. His voice did not rise. His tone did not waver. He was operating from prepared calm, the kind that belongs to a man who has known exactly how this moment would unfold since before he turned onto the road. Collins moved to the passenger door. He pulled it open. On the seat, sitting in plain view, unobstructed, exactly where it had been since before the car left the driveway, was the black leather briefcase. He unzipped it. He reached in. He pulled out the documents. He began to read. The termination letter was precise. Each line arrived like something already decided, because it had been. His full name. His badge number. A citation of the unlawful stop. A citation of the demand for ownership documentation beyond what the law requires. A citation of the arrest threat issued in response to a lawful assertion of constitutional rights. A citation of the search conducted without probable cause and against 4 explicit statements of non-consent. A reference to the 2 prior complaints. A pattern finding. An effective date of termination. Signed, Chief Daniel Coppersmith. Collins's hands began to tremble. The document crinkled at the edges where his grip had tightened, not to hold it steady, but because the body does things when the mind is processing something it was not prepared for. He read it twice. He looked up. The man standing a few feet away was watching him with the patience of someone who had known this moment was coming since the driveway. The question that came out of Collins was barely audible. Coppersmith's answer carried across the roadside without effort. Yes. That is who I am. And yes, you just failed the test. He paused. Then said something that witnesses on that roadside heard clearly, though it did not appear in most coverage that followed. I did not come here hoping you would do this. I came here because your file told me you would. And the difference between those 2 things matters more than you understand right now. Before we continue, pause here for a moment. Have you ever been stopped and felt that the law did not apply to you equally in that moment? Have you or someone you know faced what Coppersmith faced on that roadside, an assumption wearing the uniform of authority? Drop your experience in the comments. Share this if you believe this story matters. Because what comes next is the part most accountability stories never reach, the institutional reckoning. To understand why Collins behaved the way he did, you have to understand the environment that taught him it was acceptable. Harris County is the most populous county in Texas and the 3rd most populous in the United States. Houston presents itself as a model of pluralism and economic mobility. The reality inside its outer patrol districts told a different story. For more than a decade before Coppersmith's appointment, civil rights organizations had been documenting what residents in those outer districts had been describing for years longer than that. Black drivers were stopped at rates that bore no statistical relationship to traffic infraction data. A 2019 study commissioned by the county itself found that black drivers in outer Harris County patrol zones were stopped at 2.3 times the rate of white drivers in comparable zones. That number does not capture what it means in lived terms. It means that on roads where white drivers pass without incident, black drivers calculate, on certain roads, whether the car they drive and the neighborhood they are in will produce a conversation with a uniformed officer today. The study's recommendations had been clear: independent oversight, documented probable cause requirements, pattern-based auditing of individual officers, and a formal disciplinary process with teeth. What followed was a series of policy commitments that looked thorough on paper and produced, in practice, 2 rounds of verbal warnings and a filing cabinet of unresolved complaints. The department's own internal data showed that in the 5 years preceding Coppersmith's appointment, the outer patrol districts had generated 847 complaints related to racially disparate stops. Of those, 73 progressed to formal review. Of those 73, 11 resulted in any form of discipline. Of those 11, none were terminations. The most severe consequence on record was a 2-week unpaid suspension. In that environment, Collins did not develop his behavior in a vacuum. He developed it inside a system that had communicated, through every non-response to every complaint, that the behavior was tolerable. The verbal warning at the end of each review process was the cost of doing what he was doing, and the cost was low enough to keep paying it. This is what institutional accountability failure looks like from the inside. It does not look like overt permission. It looks like the absence of consequence. It looks like the space between a policy that exists on paper and enforcement that never arrives. And the officers who learn to operate in that space are not anomalies. They are products. Harris County was not unique. What made it a focal point was the scale of its documented disparity and the federal scrutiny that followed. But the pattern it represented was national in scope. The research literature on racial disparities in traffic enforcement is one of the most rigorously studied areas in criminal justice. Its findings have been consistent across geography, methodology, and time. Black and Latino drivers are stopped at higher rates than white drivers. They are searched at higher rates following those stops. Those searches produce contraband at lower rates, meaning the stops are not more productive, they are simply more frequent. The disparity is not explained by driving behavior, infraction rates, or neighborhood crime levels when the analysis controls for those variables. The 2015 Department of Justice report on Ferguson, Missouri was a landmark document not because it revealed something new, but because it named with federal authority what community members, researchers, and civil rights organizations had been documenting for years: that a police department could have written policies prohibiting racial profiling and still operate, in practice, as an instrument of racial harassment. That the gap between policy and practice was the accountability gap. And that closing it required more than better policies. It required mechanisms that made the gap visible and costly. In the years following Ferguson, a number of cities attempted reform with varying seriousness and varying success. A small number created what researchers began calling pattern-based accountability systems, automated flagging of individual officers whose stop data deviated significantly from district norms, triggering mandatory review before the behavior calcified into a complaint file. Harris County had committed to several of these measures in writing. It had implemented them partially. It had enforced them inconsistently. And the behavior continued, because the accountability did not arrive with sufficient reliability to change the calculation. What made Coppersmith's approach significant was not that it was new. Most of the tools he deployed had been recommended to Harris County years before he arrived. What was new was the willingness to use them, to treat them as operative rather than aspirational, to hold the first case that presented itself to exactly the same standard the policy said every case would be held to, regardless of timing, regardless of who the officer was, regardless of how politically inconvenient Day 3 turned out to be. A lieutenant arrived at the roadside within 12 minutes. He took in the scene with the calibration of someone who had responded to confusing calls before, but recognized immediately that this one was different. Coppersmith identified himself. He laid out the sequence without ornamentation, the stop without probable cause, the exit order backed by arrest threat, the 4 statements of non-consent, the completed search, all of it on 2 running recording devices. Collins offered an explanation. He had not known who the driver was. He had been exercising discretionary judgment. The lieutenant's response was deliberate. He acknowledged that Collins had not known the driver's identity. He said that was not the relevant question. The relevant question was whether probable cause had existed at the moment of the stop. And Collins had no credible answer to that question, because no credible answer existed. He ordered Collins to surrender his badge and weapon. Collins stood there for a moment that held all 9 years in it. The badge came off. Then the weapon. The sounds they made on the trunk of the patrol car were small in the way that endings often are, smaller than the weight they carry. The union statement was careful and clear. The stop had been a discretionary judgment call, the briefcase placement had been engineered, and the sequence amounted to entrapment of an officer who had simply been doing his job. Coppersmith's response was precise. Entrapment requires inducement to commit an act the person would not otherwise have committed. Collins had a file with 2 prior dismissed complaints for conducting identical stops on black men in luxury vehicles. He had not been induced into anything. He had been given the opportunity to do his job correctly, and had chosen, as the documented evidence consistently showed, not to. The union filed for arbitration. 6 weeks passed. The arbitration convened in a downtown conference room. Collins's attorney built his case methodically: character witnesses, district crime statistics, vehicle incongruity arguments, and the claim that Coppersmith had arrived with a predetermined outcome and manufactured the circumstances to produce it. The arbitrator had reviewed 3 categories of evidence before the hearing began: the full recordings of the stop, Coppersmith's testimony and the documentary basis for the termination, and Collins's complete complaint history including the internal review records for each prior complaint. Her preliminary questions established the framework quickly. She asked Collins's attorney to identify the specific, articulable facts that had provided reasonable suspicion for the initial stop. He provided the vehicle type and the neighborhood. She asked him to identify where in department policy or Fourth Amendment jurisprudence a luxury vehicle in a lower-income area constituted reasonable suspicion. He cited case law on vehicle incongruity. She asked him to identify which of those cases involved a vehicle whose registered owner was the driver, who had produced valid documentation, and who had committed no observable traffic infraction. He could not. The hearing ran 3 days. Both men testified. The physician who had been stopped in his BMW testified. The small business owner who had been stopped in his Mercedes testified. Their accounts matched the complaint records and matched the pattern the arbitrator had been examining in Collins's file. Her ruling ran 14 pages. On the entrapment argument, an officer with a documented history of conducting identical stops had not been induced into behavior he would not otherwise exhibit. The prior complaints were direct evidence that the behavior predated and was independent of the specific encounter. On the vehicle incongruity argument, no reasonable suspicion had existed at the moment of the stop. The driver had committed no observable infraction. Vehicle type and driver demographics do not constitute articulable suspicion under any controlling authority. On the non-consent question, 4 explicit statements documented on 2 independent recording devices. The search proceeded regardless. This was not a close question. On the prior complaint history, verbal warnings, the arbitrator wrote, do not function as prior discipline if they do not alter behavior. Their relevance here was not as evidence of prior punishment but as evidence of prior knowledge, both by Collins, who had been informed twice that the behavior was impermissible, and by the department, which had been informed twice that the behavior was occurring and had chosen not to address it with proportionate consequences. The termination was upheld on every count. The union issued no further statement. The policy framework Coppersmith presented to senior staff after the ruling was not a proposal for discussion. It was the new operational standard. Every traffic stop would require documented probable cause, specific, articulable, reviewable at the time of the stop. Body cam footage would be subject to random audit by an independent civilian oversight board with full authority to flag footage and publish findings. The department's data system would automatically flag officers whose stop demographics deviated from district norms, triggering mandatory supervisor review. One captain asked, with more directness than the others had managed, whether this meant officers would start getting terminated for judgment calls. Coppersmith said they were going to start getting terminated for constitutional violations. The difference, he said, was not semantic. Judgment calls exist within legal boundaries. When they cross those boundaries consistently and demonstrably, they stop being judgment calls. They become patterns. And patterns, as of today, have consequences. We are near the end of this story. But before we close, sit with this for a moment. What the reform that followed Collins's termination required was not new policy. Harris County already had the policy. What it required was someone willing to enforce it the first time it was tested, to treat day 3 the same as any other day, to hold the first case to the same standard as every subsequent one. That consistency, doing what the policy says when the policy is actually tested, is rarer than it should be. If this story is reaching you, share it. Drop a comment before we go. What part of this stayed with you? Real institutional reform does not arrive like a verdict. It arrives in increments, in policy language revised over multiple drafts, in training programs implemented with uneven enthusiasm, in data dashboards that begin returning different numbers, slowly, quarter by quarter. The Harris County reforms took approximately 8 months to be fully implemented across all patrol districts. The mandatory probable cause documentation requirement was in effect within 3 weeks. The Independent Oversight Board was seated 5 months in. The pattern flagging system went live at month 7. In the quarter following implementation of the documentation requirement, traffic stops in the outer districts fell by approximately 18%. The Oversight Board's deeper analysis found that the composition had shifted. Stops producing actual citations or arrests had increased. Stops with no articulable basis, stops that looked, in retrospect, like the ones in Collins's file, had decreased significantly. 2 additional officers with similar complaint histories were terminated in the 18 months following Collins's case. Both terminations were challenged through arbitration. Both were upheld. 6 other officers were placed on probationary status with mandated retraining. 4 showed measurable improvement within 6 months. 2 eventually resigned before formal termination proceedings were initiated. Community organizations that had been filing complaints for years began reporting something they had not experienced from this department before: responses that led to visible outcomes. Not always the outcome the complainant had wanted, but an outcome. A record. Evidence that the complaint had entered a system that treated it as information rather than administrative inconvenience. Complaints involving racial disparities in traffic stops fell by 73% over the following 2 years. That figure is significant. It is not complete. A 73% reduction means 27% was still happening. Reform is not the same as resolution. It is the name for the direction of travel. 5 years after that afternoon on that outer district road, Harris County was cited in a national report on municipal policing reform as one of fewer than 15 mid-sized departments in the country that had produced measurable, sustained reductions in racial disparities without a corresponding increase in other enforcement metrics. The report noted the department's independent oversight structure and its pattern flagging system as replicable models. Coppersmith was still chief. He had declined appointments at larger departments. He still drove into the outer districts several times a month, not as a test, because tests were no longer necessary, but because he had bought that car with money he had earned over 2 decades, and it belonged to him, and the roads belonged to everyone, and both of those things had been true the entire time. Seth Collins worked in private security at a commercial facility in a northern suburb of Houston. He had not spoken publicly about the case since the arbitration ruling. His name appeared occasionally in discussions of policing reform, usually as an illustration, about the role of institutional consequence, about what the absence of early accountability produces over time, about the difference between a verbal warning and a structural correction. The physician who had testified at the arbitration, the one stopped in his BMW years before Collins's termination, was asked at a community forum whether what had happened represented justice. He said he was not sure justice was the right frame. What had happened was accountability. Accountability was not the same as justice because it arrived after the harm and did not undo it. But accountability was what made the next stop less likely. It was the mechanism that converted an individual act into institutional memory. And institutional memory, he said, was the only thing that actually changed what happened on roads. He said he still thought about the stop sometimes. The way his hands had stayed on the wheel. The calculation of how to exist in a way that produced the least danger. The particular exhaustion of that calculation, of being educated, successful, driving a car he had earned, and still performing that arithmetic. He said he hoped the arithmetic was getting smaller. For the people who came after him. On roads like that one. The lesson inside this story does not announce itself like a verdict. It was present from the beginning. In the composure of a man who kept his hands visible on a steering wheel while an officer questioned whether he had the right to own what he had earned. In a briefcase placed openly on a passenger seat, not locked, not hidden, waiting to be found by the one person whose bias would lead him directly to it. In the understanding that justice, when it is patient and methodical and documented, does not need to be loud. It only needs to be true. What Coppersmith did on that third day was not improvised. It was the product of 20 years of learning what broken systems look like from the inside, how they absorb complaints, how they metabolize incidents, how they convert patterns of harm into administrative residue that sits in filing cabinets and does nothing. Collins was not a monster. He was the product of a system that had spent 9 years communicating, through the absence of consequence, that what he was doing was acceptable. The system had trained him just as effectively as any formal instruction. It had trained him to believe there was no cost. Coppersmith changed the cost. Not by shouting. Not by press conference alone. By doing what the policy said the department would do, in the first case that tested whether it actually would. That is what accountability looks like when it has nowhere left to hide. Power is not always visible. Truth does not always hurry. But in the end, either can be concealed for long by the people who most need them to be. If this story reached you, hit the like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Someone who is tired of being told that the system is changing. Someone who needs to see what it looks like when it actually does. And before you go, drop a comment. What stood out to you the most? What part of this story are you still thinking about? Until next time, stay informed, stay grounded, and I will see you in the next one.